All right, please be quiet again. We've had our moment of transition. I'm Greg Lindsay. I'm resuming as the moderator of this session here, handing over from Philipp, who has opted to participate instead. I can't say I blame him. I've been eagerly anticipating this session myself all day long. So with that, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to join us on stage. So not just Ed Glaeser and Adam Greenfield, and Philipp as well, but also we're privileged to have Janette Sadik-Khan, former transportation czar of New York City, now at Bloomberg Associates, and Anthony Townsend, author of Smart Cities and now an advisor to Sidewalk, is that fair to say? An advisor to Sidewalk Labs. So please, everyone come up on stage. After you, choose a seat.
Oh, such a gentleman.
Trained well.
Trained well.
All right, well with that, as Janette was just saying, it's hard to know where to begin after such two great talks. But I think as a way of getting into the session, I'd like to offer both you and Anthony sort of the opportunity to play respondents to this. I think is only fair to let you have your own piece in this. Not quite 15 minutes, but we can get in. I don't know if either of you has an immediate sort of impulse to this. I don't think you have to pick a winner in this, but I would love to know sort of your various reactions. As, of course, the one former public servant on stage, and then, of course, Anthony as a technologist who's deeply rooted in urbanism and can really sort of approach it from both angles. So, Janette, would you like the pleasure, please?
Sure, I'd love to. I mean, it is a tough act to follow, and but I do think it's really interesting to see the common theme in both of your presentations, and I think it's less about what the technology is, and it's more about what are the kind of cities that we want to create. And so when I look at it, and I think what you're seeing mayors around the country and around the world look at is, it's not really just a disruption of this technology. It is really more of the platform for making cities better. And how do we actually get that done? And so when I look at what are the kinds of cities that we want to see in the next 5, 10 years, we want cities that are safer, more accessible, as Ed pointed out, more opportunities for all. And so I think it's really important that it's not just about what is on our smartphones, it's really also about what is on our streets. And that is really what makes cities great. People don't move to cities because of the technology that's there. They move to cities because of what Ed and Adam pointed out, which is that dynamism that comes from being close to people. And that's certainly what we saw in New York City. You know, when we repurposed 180 acres of former roadway space, created more spaces for people to get around by bike and by bus and walking, they flocked to these spaces. They were really hungry for that space between buildings. And that really is a big part of what's going on. So the challenge, I think, is, this genie is not going back in the bottle, right? I mean, I don't think that anybody thinks that the future of our cities is, you know, how we deal with transportation network companies is, you know, by, you know, hailing cabs, et cetera. I think if you ask audiences, like, do you think the future of transportation is the taxi industry from the 1930s, or do you think it's more along the lines of what you see today with Uber and Lyft and all of that? I think you see that people are really voting with their pocketbooks there. And you can't argue against a technology that is making our streets safer. I mean, the fact that people aren't drinking and driving is huge. 30% of the deaths that happen on our roads, the 33,000 people that die, 30% of those are from drinking and driving. And so there are really big social impacts that can come from this next technology. But I don't think about, it's really about looking at mobility as a service and not cars as a service. Because I think otherwise we're going to be making the same mistake using a 21st century technology to solve problems from the 20th century. And I think that's a big concern. So I don't think we'd need just different cars. I think we're talking about different streets. And so how do we set the table to invite people to those streets and harness that technology so that it works really, really well? I chair an organization called NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is the transportation leaders in 40 of the largest cities that are wrestling with these issues. Because mayors are really on the front lines of dealing with these new technologies. And I can say that one of the things that's really interesting that everybody's wrestling with is, what do you do with this new windfall of space that can come from these new technologies? Can we use this to build more sidewalks, to build more bike lanes, to build more public space for people? I think that's one hopeful opportunity that's out there. How do we solve our affordable housing crisis? Can't we use that space to create much more opportunity in terms of what we provide inside the city in terms of the housing that's there? And I think that we really need to look at these technologies as a two-way street. So one of the issues that I think NACTO is spending a lot of time on is, how do we set the table so that it's fair for everybody that's there, transportation network companies, taxi companies, et cetera, and make sure that these technologies are safe for everyone, are accessible for everyone, and don't really tilt the playing field one way or another. And so I think it's very important to set the rules, as Ed pointed out, to make sure that government is helpful in nudging the right activities, not outlining every single thing that thou shalt do, but nudging it in the right way and really setting the table. Importantly, I think data transparency is a huge one, and that is something that I think that cities are really starting to sit up and pay much more attention to, because you can get the O&D information, and this information, whether it's vehicle miles traveled, whether it's the O&D information, whether it's the speed, it is critical information for how we manage our streets more efficiently and how we actually leverage this technology to make our streets better. Mike Bloomberg, as you probably know, data-driven mayor, as he states, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And so we brought lots and lots of data to the streets of New York City, and we put 13,000 GPS devices in the 13,000 yellow cabs in New York City. And guess what? It was this treasure trove of information that really improved the way we designed our streets. And it was almost like the city was itself a simulation. And so to the extent that we can use this technology to better drive transportation investment decisions so we don't end up with the monorails, and kind of transportation strategies that don't work, I think there is a huge opportunity here. But this data needs to be shared. If it's a shared economy, you need to share the data. And I think that the return on investment on the digital side needs to match what the transportation infrastructure is on the investment side for cities. And I guess I would sort of close that we really do need to make sure that this is an integrated network. It is not just about one killer app or another killer app. It really is about designing an integrated network, and that's everything from the pricing of this network, and I feel really strongly about the opportunity that's there to use GPS devices to measure VMT and charge for that. That really can make congestion pricing actually happen universally, easily. Very, very important to do. And I think that and connecting the first mile, last mile with transit is really key. And pricing this network for the first time properly is a huge opportunity. So I'm very excited about it. And I would just add, listening earlier today, I really do think that the land use regulations are a critical component of this. Transportation and land use are married and need to continue to be married. And I'm hopeful that on this panel we can get into a little bit of discussion about how that goes.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you for that, for your opening response. Anthony, particularly as someone who's now working with Sidewalk Labs, which is attempting to truly situate these technologies in the street, I'm very curious your thoughts on this debate, this divide as well.
Yeah, I can't resist the opportunity to say that transportation and land use planning are in a very dysfunctional marriage in the United States. All right, that didn't work. So one of the things that's really been bothering me today is how fast and loose many of us have been playing on the stage with the, I'll just call it the mythology of transportation in cities in the United States. So we've heard a lot of stories about what the car did and what streetcars did and what government did. And there's been lots of discussion in the sidebars like, was that true? I didn't know that. Is that really, the factor that drove where we are today? And I think both of these speakers got at that in different ways. Ed's example about the Croton Aqueduct, that there was a lag of a couple decades before that actually had like a citywide impact on public health. And there was probably all kinds of other things going on in medicine and public health. I'm a big fan of The Nick. Does anybody watch this show on HBO about this like wave of medical innovation at the turn of the century? So, there is a lag, right? Disruption. We haven't talked about the time scale of disruption and the dynamics of disruption. And it actually tends to play out really, really slowly, even today with digital technology. When I was at MIT as a grad student, I think 16 years ago this fall, in Kent Larson's studio workshop, we were thinking about the neighborhood of the future. And one of the proposals that our team came up with was what we called bodega bots. And these were little robots that would, you'd put your package in it at the corner shipment point, like the neighborhood store where your e-commerce delivery, e-commerce we called it back then, not shopping. And it would follow you home, so you didn't have to carry your package. And FedEx wouldn't have to roll a truck every 4 hours to your house like they do now. And that was 16 years ago, right? And just last week, Skype announced basically that they're going to bring that technology, or the founders of Skype are going to bring that technology to market. So that's like the time scale that we're talking about, even in the on-demand .com overinflated investment bubble that we're living in. So let's take that as like the best case scenario, 15 years from grad student idea to entrepreneur idea. Another 15 years until a good part of the developed world economy actually uses something like that. Adam got to this issue of time dynamics talking about social constructivism, and I'm completely in that camp of, and I think Ed probably made a compelling case for it too, that firms, governments, individual consumers, philanthropic organizations make choices about which technologies we're going to push forward and which ones we aren't. That has a real impact on how the world is shaped. So, the point of bringing all this up is to say that we really need to think about like how long it takes these things to play out, how long it takes them to play out like in different parts of the world, where investment schedules are different and time frames are different. My favorite quote, from Rem Koolhaas, in the mid-90s was that, like, I think in the UK it took 10 architects a month to design a building, and in China it was 2 guys on a Macintosh on a Saturday night. Different places build and invest on different timescales. And the fact that it takes that long to play out means that there's going to be revolutions, that's the disruption we're talking about, and there's going to be counter-revolutions, and counter-revolutions to the counter-revolution. The things that Google did with self-driving cars have mobilized the auto industry onto a much different timetable around automation than they were initially on. Nest. Nest's business strategy was to just violate a bunch of Honeywell patents and settle after the fact. They didn't care. They played by a completely different set of rules. But Honeywell is now in every Home Depot selling the exact same technology and pulling market share away from Nest. So, these things play out, and really, what that is about power. And I think we're really misguided if we don't think about like what these stakeholder maps around all these issues look like. We heard a tiny little bit about organized labor today, when that could be, one of the biggest either obstacles or accelerators to adoption of a lot of these technologies in the public sector. We haven't talked much about the specific constraints that particular cities put on technologies, and I think that's a big deal too, when these global technology solutions come down to roost and deal with tough local conditions. And that was kind of the approach that we took to forecasting, to a project I did last year at NYU that was funded by Rockefeller Foundation called Reprogramming Mobility. So we had to reprogram mobility before we could disrupt it. And we hypothesized 4 alternative futures looking at metropolitan areas in the US 15 years out, so 2030, which felt like enough time for things to change, but not to be so far out in the future as to be science fiction. And this is kind of like a forecasting methodology that's been around for a while. And there's 4 archetypical scenarios. And this is really, any story you tell about the future will fall into one of these categories. You can try it yourself. It's pretty good. Growth, collapse, constraint, and transformation. And I'll just really quickly summarize them. In depth at reprogrammingmobility.org. Growth was basically sustainable sprawl powered by solar electric vehicles and self-driving vehicles. And of course, that took place in Atlanta, where despite multiple cataclysmic snowstorms, the city still thinks that's a good mobility system. Collapse, Greg talked about earlier, was set in Los Angeles. And that was really a world where automation run amok. The market just filled with different models of self-driving cars, hackers building their own self-driving cars, cheap imports from overseas coming in, and very poor regulation to get them to play together nicely. And essentially, you'd see the kind of behaviors that you see today in Google cars being designed in that they're overly cautious. And that just doesn't allow large numbers of them to share the road well. My home region of New York area was the setting for the constraint scenario. I live in New Jersey, and I was kind of fantasizing how we might respond to what Chris Christie, our governor, was doing to our transportation infrastructure, essentially stealing from our transit to subsidize the gas tax so he could run for president. And the very real challenge that the region faces now with an incredibly vulnerable trans-Hudson transportation linkage, when at the same time, New Jersey is really the only place for the region to add population. And the idea there was to use automation not for private vehicles, but for transit, which is something that I think is a huge opportunity. And then finally, the transformation scenario, which is this aspirational, tech-driven scenario, which we set in Boston. And I chose Boston not only because I went to school here, because there's great institutions here, but because there's a huge population of early adopters here. There's something like 300,000 or 400,000 college students in the area who are always willing to experiment with new ways of living. And then both Google and Amazon's two biggest robotics acquisitions are in the Boston metropolitan area. So in a world where we're going to have heavily automated freight to keep up with what we heard this morning from the DOT, that freight's going to basically grow at twice the rate of population, we're going to need robots to help do it. So I encourage you to check that out and be happy to talk about the scenarios.
Thank you, Anthony. Philip, would you like to jump in here, or may I start asking questions? I have some great segue out of Anthony here, so I leave it to you if you have thoughts.
No, you go with Anthony.
All right.
That's absolutely fine.
All right, well, great. Well, Anthony then, at the end of it, or describing those scenarios, the various forms in which technology was adopted in various conditions and various political climates, really sets up the question I have, which is sort of a dual question for Ed and Adam, or it sort of branches off from there. The one question I kept asking myself, Ed, during your talk, is the way you describe centripetal versus centrifugal technologies is should I place value judgments on these? Should I favor, because I do personally favor the centripetal technologies you described and how they favor the city versus the centrifugal ones that created sprawl. And the question I have for you in this regard, which I thought you would answer but you did not, is the smartphone, which is the technology underlying transportation network companies, the technology that allows us mass orchestration of resources at the individual level, something we implicitly assume is a ubiquitous technology and will be going forward. Is that a centripetal or centrifugal technology? And then the question I have for Adam, branching out of that, which you can answer second, is that technologically determinist of me to think so? And if so, knowing how you feel about Uber, in the sense of you have written in the past that the fact that couchsurfing and others have failed because Uber, like a Death Star, which is now being compared to, has been able to bring a tremendous amount of resources to bear on the user experience and creating a seamless experience that laser-like goes into consumers that causes them to forget about more loosely joined communal aspects of this. Is it possible? Can we actually socially construct the smartphone and whatever comes out of it as a positive, centripetal, socially constructed for that? Or will it always favor the organizations that are able to muster massive resources to focus laser-like in this sort of late capitalism? So those are two very long questions for you, but Ed, I would love you to start.
So I think there were two questions there, one of which was judging the smartphone, and the second of which was talking about value judgments about centrifugal versus centripetal forces, which is fundamentally a value judgment about cities versus lower density living. I think all else being equal, I always root for cities, right? It's who I am. But that being said, when I counsel national governments, I believe the right national approach is not to pick winners across space, just as it's not to pick winners across companies. Now, that being said, we have some pretty severe distortions in the system already which work against cities. And I think that you can root for cities until those distortions are eliminated. So let me just give you a few of them. One of the big ones, of course, is we don't price the energy use that people engage in when they live in lower density areas. So there are, and I am terribly sorry if this offends you, but I'm still going to use the word. There are negative externalities associated with using energy, and people who live in lower density areas drive longer and have bigger houses. I do myself, as I moved to a lower density area when I started acquiring small children about a decade ago. Until we price that, there will be a national and global benefit from people centralizing in cities. A second example of this is, in fact, it's not only that we don't price carbon, we subsidize people to drive longer and longer distances. And I just want to support this so strongly, that one of the madnesses of the post-recession world is that we have increasingly subsidized highway construction, not with gas taxes, and this is not just about New Jersey, although New Jersey is particularly guilty. I don't want to, but this is a national thing. This has been a highlight of the Obama administration's approach to transportation, is not to raise gas taxes, which is unpopular, but to use general tax revenues, which means fundamentally ordinary Americans are subsidizing people to drive longer and longer distances. And that's a terrible mistake. Third example, and American public policy making has been guilty of this for many, many decades, is the way that we subsidize home ownership, right? Home ownership is the American dream. The American dream can only lie behind a white picket fence in the suburb. Well, fine. You subsidize home ownership. You're implicitly subsidizing people moving out of high-density apartments into low-density homes because of the enormously strong correlation between structure type and ownership type. More than 85% of single-family detached houses in this country are owner-occupied. More than 85% of multi-unit dwellings are rented. If you act as if the only American dream is ownership, then you're saying get out of your rented apartment and go buy a house somewhere, right? And finally, of course, the tremendous distortions, and in fact, they're the most important and the most humanly stressing, is the way that we do public education, is the fact that so many parents feel like they have to leave cities, despite the many great schools that exist in many of our cities. So many parents believe this, that they have to move outside. And until we make sure that a kid growing up in Dorchester has the same access to education as a kid growing up in Concord, we're going to continue to have this issue. And all of these are distortions that mean that, in fact, too few people are living in cities relative to outside areas, which is where I root for Centripetal. But if you're able to get rid of that, yeah, I think, look, I'm an economist. I'm a child of the Scottish Enlightenment. I think it's a good thing that people have choices. I think it's a good thing that people have choices across neighborhoods. I think it's a good thing that people have choices across areas. I'm not a lifestyle consultant. I'm someone who believes in actually freedom and believes that people should be able to opt between different areas, and that great cities are archipelagos of neighborhoods. Now, are smartphones centripetal or centrifugal? I think it's hard to answer that, but I think the fascinating thing is that they're not more centrifugal. Right? So if you think about smartphones and all forms of information technology, 30 years ago when the cyber-seers and the techno-prophets were looking at this, what they predicted was along with the death of distance, was going to be a death of cities. We were all just going to go to whatever electronic cottages we chose to inhabit and just dial it in, because after all, we had these fantastic smartphones that enabled us to do this. And this is sort of the very simple determinist view, and it proved to be completely wrong. And one of the reasons it proved to be completely wrong is that electronic interactions are not perfect substitutes for face-to-face interactions, and in many cases, they are complements with face-to-face interactions. You use your smartphone to figure out where we're going to go have dinner together. We use your smartphone to figure out what's a good restaurant to eat at, or what's a good park to work in, right? And I sort of fundamentally believe that connecting in cyberspace is never going to compare with sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile, right? These are things that are very special, and smartphones help to make that form of human interaction possible. So I think that I can't judge on net. It clearly does both, but I think the amazing thing is relative to what we thought about with the sort of, all centrifugal force from these technologies, it's proven to be a heck of a lot more centripetal than I think many people, including myself, might have thought 30 years ago.
Great, thanks. Adam.
Yeah, I guess part of the problem in listening to Ed and reacting to that is I just conceive of the world in such a fundamentally, profoundly different way. I'm not a quantifier by nature. I don't use those categories. So I'm afraid that my reactions are they're certainly not as well studied and well practiced, and they probably won't satisfy you. But let me take a hack at this. I think the smartphone actually did kill the city. I think it killed the city as we knew it. It certainly destroyed the social signaling function of neighborhoods, and particularly neighborhoods associated or businesses associated with particular subcultures. I think about what Grindr does to the existence of gay bars, for example, is probably the canonical example. I think cities just work differently now. There's kind of a flattening of urban space. Neighborhoods are just less interesting. They're closer to these almost primal functions of this is a residence and this is a commercial strip. I expected cities to have gotten more interesting, and my feeling is they've gotten less. They're actually, these days, sort of repeating modules of the last commercial propositions which survive in the rent regime of the core city. So I do think that the smartphone killed the city. I don't think of it in terms of being centripetal or centrifugal, but I think of it as a texture and an ambiance and an affect. And those things, the city that we move through now is vastly different than the cities I remember, and I'm tempted to say just much less interesting. Maybe not for you, but definitely for me. And so I will make reference to my own feelings. Technology is a funny thing. The older I get, the polar positions make less and less sense to me. They're less and less satisfying. I think that a technology like ubiquitous access to the global network in our pocket for a cost effectively of zero, it does both of those things simultaneously at different levels in different ways for different people at different moments of the day. It certainly brings new networks of power and influence into being. But they might find that their ability to shape the urban environment is curtailed by the pre-existing power arrangements that survived and thrived under older dispensations of power. I place a great amount of hope in the distribution of power through the distribution of access and information. And I've been bitterly disappointed by that again and again. And I assume that I will be bitterly disappointed again in the future, but I keep having the hope. I keep having the hope that we will use these devices in our pockets not as gateways to limitless consumer choice, because on a planet of constrained resources, I don't think that there can be anything as limitless consumer choice, but as nudges towards a better and more fructifying way of living with one another. And that to me means engagement and participation and things which are exactly the opposite of consumer choice in that they require effort. It's a really hard sell to make at this moment in time. If Uber's overwhelming value proposition to you is seamlessness and you don't think about it, and it shows up at your doorstep and it drops you off where you want to go, and you don't even need to deal with the driver as a human being, and eventually that driver will be replaced by an algorithm anyway, so even better. Everything that I believe that ubiquitous networked access can do for us is in the nature of the opposite. It means getting up close and personal with difference. And that will always and inevitably mean discomfort. And I think the way we grow, again, this is language that maybe as alien to you as the language of externality is to me, but I think the way we grow as human beings and the way we become the most profound versions of ourselves that we're capable of being is by affording that which cities do for us for free and always have, which is exposing us to every register of difficulty and difference and asking that we nevertheless surmount those difficulties and come to a modus vivendi with the people around us who have profoundly different beliefs about the proper ordering of resources and, everything else, by the way. And I hope that's a satisfying answer. It's as close as I'm going to get to one.
Thank you, Ed. Philip, you've been so patient.
Yes, I would very much like to connect what we have just heard from Ed and Adam to the practical world of Janette, of making decisions, the governance around it. And I guess throughout the day I've picked up this idea, I don't know whether people would agree, but that in some ways technology isn't directional and we have an opportunity to make it more directional, to make it serve a certain particular purpose and go back to this very essential question about which problem is it there to solve. 2 hours ago in the other room, we were talking primarily about carbon emissions. But let's make it even simpler than that. If we're talking about implications for an urban age and we're talking about transportation, globally at least, the single biggest challenge is mass motorization. Still, it's going back in India, in China, in sub-Saharan Africa to the period of sort of using the automobile as we've done it in this country post-war and in Europe as well. Now, here we feel like we are sort of leaving that era behind. On the other side of the world, this era is just about being embraced. Yes, the future looks slightly better because they're also rolling out big public transport technologies, and so it's a bit more nuanced. Now, but back to the point of directionality of these technologies, is there an opportunity that these, let's call them more sustainable urban transport solutions, are allowing us to create some kind of atmosphere of global divergence of those, at the moment, very contradictory trends? And that is, I guess, then, well, in theory at least, would have to be translated to making, for example, sure that any form of making the car more autonomous and being able to operate more independent does really leave behind an area of ownership, of underutilization, of the enormous space consumption of these vehicles, and actually a relatively precise list of things which we know cities would need if we take quality of life serious, if we take sort of even economic productivity serious. But how do we actually introduce this directionality of engaging with technological innovation and then also the rollout of those technologies?
Thank you, Philip. Janette, I would love you to answer that, and I want to piggyback onto Philip's comments in the sense of, it was interesting you described, government as a nudger. And I'm curious about, as a reaction almost to Adam's point there about the fact that, the seductions of Uber or other, that people are acting as consumers, is it the responsibility of government to basically take a more proactive role in understanding the downstream externalities of choosing very easy, seamless technologies now, just in the sense of, we should have understood, or far-sighted government figures should have understood what Walmart was going to do to American main streets, and sort of basically intervene correctly then. Are we failing to understand the effects of Uber now, and is it the full role of government to really step in and be a more proactive force in delivering services and making sure they're delivered in an equitable way? I guess in the sense of, I will just root this in a concrete example. Robin Chase talks about the heaven or hell of driverless cars. The hell is zero occupancy, permanently going around, permanently polluting, and the heaven would be a very, very small, highly utilized fleet. I don't think she says this, but ideally I would see it as managed by the city. It would be the future of public transport in that regard. Is it the role of the city to actually create something like that? Do you see that as your job?
There are like 35 questions that you
I know, just break off.
He does that.
Break off, it's like taffy, break off
nice.
the
I'll pick up whatever
on it.
strand I like. Well, look, I mean, I think that there's no question that government has a role to play here, and we're seeing this. I mean, we're starting to see cities really wake up to the impact that this is having on their streets, and the difficulty actually of putting some, roles around it, like putting that genie back in the bottle and trying to actually get a handle on it. I think, one of the things that's really been interesting to me over the last 25 years that I've been in transportation is that you take a look at what happens at the federal level, and I've said this before, like the last big idea that the federal government had in transportation was the interstate highway system, right? And so we created that 50 years ago. We talked about this, right? We did it. Check, we're done, okay? Now we need to be focusing on some other roles that we can be doing so that we are connecting our people, we are connecting our cities, we're actually using transportation in a way to, build a better platform for everyone. And I don't think that we're seeing that kind of leadership at the federal level at all. And so what's happened is it's really fallen down to cities to actually take that role on. And part of it is the abandonment of the federal government from the transportation funding scene, because you're actually seeing less and less investment. And something that Tim Papandreou mentioned, in a previous session was that I think it's important to understand that these technologies just don't come down from the mount, onto our streets. Our streets are in pretty bad shape. There is a huge transportation funding deficit. You don't have to go far, just right out this front door, and you see like completely, potholed streets and bridges that are not in a state of good repair. So I think it's important to ground some of this discussion in the fact that we have major infrastructure challenges right now that we have to address, that I think is a really important piece of how we look at using and harnessing these technologies to provide some of the funding that we need to actually set the table properly for our cities and for people to grow and thrive, for businesses and neighborhoods to grow and thrive as we accommodate more and more people into cities, right? Because we're not going to be able to innovate our way out of this if we don't start to take care of some of the basics that are there. So I think it's really important to take a look at that. And I do think that the role of cities, you're starting to see this now. I think it's really important that we start to take a look at not also VMT when we're looking at our streets, but passenger miles traveled. And so starting to change some of the inputs in how we actually look at these things, I think, is going to be very important. And the carrying capacity of our streets, so that we just don't incentivize more and more drivers to come out and circle around our cities to pick up more and more passengers within 30 seconds or within a minute. That's not really the future of our cities. And again, I think taking a look at the benefits that are associated with public transportation and using the financing, using the technology to incentivize first mile, last mile, make our transit systems work better, that's a critical component of cities of the future. We're not going to get everybody onto these little pod cars and eliminate public transportation. Again, that's why I think we need to take a network approach, and we can use technology to make our streets more efficient and more effective, and that's really what we need to take a look at it. And it's not just going to be this silver bullet, going forward, if we don't really take a look at what we can do here. And it involves ensuring that we've got common standards in terms of accessibility and service requirements and living wage and lots of things that are really important for the future of cities.
Well, I have a question for Anthony and Adam in this regard. So since you invoked Tim, I interviewed Tim for the research project I'm working on. Sorry, Tim, it was on the record. And Tim mentioned as his fear, Tim emphasized that basically what he imagined was, of course, would be an eventual blurring of public and private services, fulfilling various contracts, et cetera, that as long as they're developing great service. But Tim mentioned in this, and if I represented accurately, his fear is that eventually the service, because it was not being operated by a highly legible fleet of city-owned, mandated, uniform buses, the system would become illegible to anyone who did not have a smartphone with the technological capabilities to see it, that it would become invisible at street level, and that therefore you would only see it if you had access to the service on your phone, your portal. So my question for Adam, who's nodding to this, and Anthony is, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? How do we make sure that the technological side of these services is also visible and accessible to those who are who most need it?
So that is probably the best question you could ask in this building. This is the place, the building, to walk around if you want to see the future of how people are going to interact with computers, or at least ideas about how people are going to interact with computers. And yes, smartphone is important. Eric Goldwyn's called it like the most important transportation innovation in the last decade. But it's really a transitional technology. I think 10, 15, 20 years out from now, most of us will probably not interact directly with information and apps using that little handheld screen, or at least not exclusively. You can already see this with all the voice interactive systems that there's a lot of rapid progress being made on other kinds of interfaces that are much more intuitive and much more accessible to the global population, to senior citizens, which are the wealthiest, fastest growing, most politically important constituency, and have a future in cities as well. So, I think it's almost a non-issue. And if it is still an issue 15 years from now, just give everybody a phone, because it'll be cheaper than almost anything else you could do, as a way of giving them opportunity and access.
Yeah, I only partially agree with that. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but what we're forgetting is, again, things that are critical to the texture and affect of urban life. I mean, what would London be without red buses and black cabs? It is so much a part of that city's identity and sense of itself, and by the way, of its tourist value proposition as well, if you're really a bean counter. So I want to stress that not every technology is instantiated in lines of code, and there are technologies that we don't plug in. Some technologies are as simple as a coat of paint and a vivid brand identity, or a catchy name, or a signage system. I've got probably 5 books on my bookshelf that are about the identity design of the world's, this is probably, in this room, is probably the only place on the planet right now where I can confess to having a bookshelf about the identity design of transit systems and not feel like I'm absolutely the biggest nerd in the room. Because I'm sure that many of you have these same books as well. Legibility is not just something that happens on the screen of a device or over the earpiece of a wireless headset or coming out of the dashboard of a vehicle. Legibility is something that's designed, and I want to hammer this point home. Design is it's a structured series of choices about the ways in which we represent the option space that's available to us, and it is. It tends to be overlooked when engineering and pragmatics come to the fore in terms of determining option spaces. I am a great believer in the power of design to democratize, equalize, and make more just than would otherwise be the case. And that's the only thing I would add to what Anthony says.
Philip.
Just a very small personal story. About 10 years ago, we had a discussion and a competition in London about new street signage and new maps in the public space. And at the time, I remember perfectly well where I felt like, why are we doing this now? I mean, we're just about having these phones which will tell us everything. And, you know, I sort of predicted I will never, ever going to use these street maps, which you now find on every corner. You know what? I do it every day. Rather than sort of fiddling my phone, I love to go to these actual paper plans and find where I am and navigate. And I think this is just a small example where we have been seeing a much stronger sort of parallel rolling out of systems, which also then help with the resilience and the equity around, you know, buffering in some ways these differences, who can do what.
I think that's a really important point, and to both of your points, because you know, people love to walk around. People love to go to cities and walk around in cities. That's one of the surprises, you know, those spontaneous collisions that you have with people. That's incredible. We took a page out of the London map and created this New York City wayfinding system. One of the reasons we did it is we did this poll and we found out that at any given time, you know, 10% of New Yorkers were lost. And those are just the ones that would admit it. So, you know, and you've probably seen that where like you ask a New Yorker for directions, they're like, no problem, right over there. And, you know, it's not there. And so it was an issue. But the other piece is that New Yorkers themselves really, you know, you expand your mental map of the city. You know, normally, you probably have this too. You walk in the same 5, 10 blocks. You've got the same, you know, you pick up groceries here, fruit here, kid there. You know, we go to the same sort of places. And so when you have a map of, you know, that shows you all these different places, you explore much more readily. If you know there's a system, regular system of signs, you'll take advantage of that. And it actually has great economic development benefits too, because, you know, you spread that people, you know, to different stores that you wouldn't go to otherwise, all sorts of different surprises. And I think, you know, with the technology, we're starting to lose this surprise element of the city, right? It is to what Adam is talking about, that sort of intangible piece that's there that makes cities great, that it's not just about the in demand, on your hand, you know, kind of thing. And it is that, but to the point about parallel systems, you know, I think technology can do a tremendous amount to help us. I mean, I get around with Waze, I get around with Google Maps. I mean, it's key for my, you know, how I navigate the city and the world. But there's so many other important elements to it that are complementary to it that I think are really important that we don't, that we need to pay attention to as we start to have these conversations, and that we have these conversations in lots of other places other than, you know, places like these, because it's very important as we're designing our cities that we're designing for the people that are beyond. This is a fantastic community here at MIT, but there are much bigger communities, as you find when you deal with very complex systems and places like.
I want to involve Ed here for a second, since you've been listening to this. And this is what I go back to when I was asking about centripetal versus centrifugal. I mean, you know, when you were during your talk, you know, I kept hearing echoes of Jane Jacobs' Economy of Cities, of course, and you know, in her discussions about, you know, obviously the diversity of the city producing new work. That, I guess, was my fear of the phone. In hearing these arguments, you know, the notion of the smartphone is creating a centrifugal force in the sense of we are creating a pocket, a seamless pocket isolated from others in our mind. And I'm curious about whether this has deleterious effects on the city over time to those, you know, unplanned, diverse encounters that produce all of the greatest effects, the fusion effect, as Louis Betancourt likes to call it.
I think it's much less predictable and probably even much less powerful than we're suggesting. I think, you know, I don't think it's so much actually that I mean, I share exactly the same value for unplanned, diverse connections. I share the same value for uncomfortable situations in cities. I just don't think the smartphone is that powerful. I just look at the past 10 years. I don't see that urban life has changed. I see a 30-year trend towards chain stores that I find unpleasant. But you know, that's not a specific thing to the smartphone. And the smartphone also enables, you know, me to find quirky little things that hadn't existed before. Both things go on. I don't know that I can sign that in any clear empirical way. I wanted to highlight one thing though that's I think really important about the distinction between the way that an economist looks at this and the way that other forms of urbanists look at this, which is it's actually not, in some sense, it's not that I look at a particular neighborhood and I say, I like this makes me feel good, or this makes me feel bad. That's actually very much not the way that we're supposed to look at the world. It's how we're very much trained not to look at the world, in fact. We're supposed to have a certain amount of respect for consumer choice, which is really just individual freedom, right? I don't know. My tastes are fairly quirky in lots of ways. I don't know why I should be able to dictate what particular people like to live in versus not. And when I look at what's going on in terms of cities, the reason why I don't think that cities are dying is because a lot of people seem to want to live there right now, right? That we see a huge tilt in terms of both quantities, in terms of new housing units building this. And this is just looking at the Boston metro area housing permits over the last 15 years. So you look at the metro area as a whole, we're still way down relative to the boom. We're 1/3 less than we were at the metro areas as a whole. We've tilted massively within the metro area towards multifamily from single family, so a huge tilt towards density. But also what's really amazing is just Boston relative to 10 years ago. Metro area is way down. Boston's double what it was during the boom in terms of new construction. Now, part of that is a somewhat more enlightened view towards land use planning, and I want to agree completely with everything that was said here about transportation and land use, but part of it's also demand. Part of it's the fact that people want to live in these cities. And you see this obviously in prices as well, which is unfortunate, but it's there. And we see this in a whole new generation of entrepreneurs coming out of MIT who want to be in Kendall Square, who want the grittiness of urban fabric, who want this instead of being on Route 128 in office parks. So when I sort of look at the long run in cities, it's not what I want. I mean, who cares what I want or what I like? It's what we see around us in terms of the general trend. And I just can't look at this and think that the city is dead at all. I think it's vibrant. It has problems. It has problems that require both public and private solutions. But I don't in any sense see cities as dying or dead.
Can I follow up with Ed on the directionality question? Because I know, as an economist, in Britain we constantly hear you don't win, you don't choose the winners, and we need to be careful, and we need to just leave this world bubbling up, and we observe. If you hear sort of people maybe with a stronger normative agenda, because they think whatever their values are, everyone should believe in. But is there something where you would accept an argument where national or city government should start steering the story about how the autonomous car is currently bubbling up, and maybe even say, look, we are a city, we believe in public transportation, bring in the sort of vehicle that runs by itself, but it cannot be possibly owned by individuals.
Public ownership is a tricky question, and I think it's important not to be doctrinaire about this in lots of different ways. So there's an example that I'm very fond of, which is, in fact, the water provision in New York, the Croton Aqueduct, was preceded by an attempt to do this with a public-private partnership. So a character called Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, hired another character called Alexander Hamilton, who he would, of course, later shoot on the shores of the Hudson. But before he hired him, before he shot him, he hired him to be his lawyer. And what Burr wanted was a bank. And the way he was going to get a bank was by promising the city of New York to have a private water company that would all be subsidized by the ability to do some banking. Right now, of course, the economist immediately thinks this is nuts. You don't generate some incredibly socially valuable activity like providing clean water by saying to a company, look, you could do something completely different, which is banking, when far more lucrative. And of course, this company still exists, right? And it never produced much water, but it does in fact do a lot of banking. Its current name is JP Morgan Chase, which was the Chase Manhattan Bank, which was the bank of the Manhattan Water Company. It was not until you had public ownership of water that you actually got water provision that actually mattered. And we have seen in terms of the literature, Eduardo Engel of Yale is probably the most detailed work on this. We've seen the literature on public-private partnerships in sub-Saharan Africa being a disaster. In Chile, much more mixed. Right? Some positive things, and certainly many of the cases of privatization of services in the US have not gone so badly, right? But it's an individual case. You don't want to in any sense say that it's always one is good and always one is bad. I would say the same thing in terms of driverless cars, right? I don't see this as being, something that is in any sense trouble-free that you want to just leave go. I mean, to start with, you have the issue of this is public space to begin with, and you want to regulate the public space. Secondly, you have the issue of safety, which is a very real issue. So I don't see this as any one which you can make it regulation-free, but I'm not sure that you'd want to ban all forms of private individuals. You just want rules about it to make sense. But I can't end without saying one final thing, which is, the thing where we do want public ownership or public management, we want a lot more of it, and we want a lot more technology on it, is the bus, right? Buses are a fantastic transportation technology, right? They're cheap, they're flexible. Right? There's an old line that 40 years of transportation of economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. And in fact, the whole deal with buses is making them cool, making them fun, making them learning, making them work, because they provide mobility for those who have less. And that is a public function, and it's a function that I think is, at least as important in terms of providing mobility for lower income people than anything we do around driverless cars.
And I think that since you found the one thing on which I probably full-throatedly agree on Ed Glaeser on, in the entire universe, that might actually be a convenient place to bring it in for a landing, because you're not going to get better than that.
Yeah.
That's true. I would say we can all agree that buses are amazing. So, and we're already eating into your time here, so I'm sorry, we won't have time for Q&A. I encourage you all to buttonhole our panelists outside and delve into this further. So what's going to happen now is we're going to take, I believe, Ryan will correct me if I'm wrong, a quick break now, and then at 5:30, we're going to go downstairs, and we're going to gather in the main lobby of the Media Lab to do the poster session that will last from 5:30 to 6:30. So please, another round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
We have 5:32.
Didn't we have until? We have 5:30. This panel. Yeah.
5:30? Oh, I was wrong. Until 5:30. We're going to keep going. The clock has been running down and then ran over. Do we have more time?
You want to have drinks, man?
No. Ryan, what's the call on this? We can keep going and we can open this up
No,
now.
Q&A is the best part.
There's some hurriedly
Yes,
questions. Well,
Q&A.
now we're in chaos. Q&A, who has questions? Anyone?
It's chaotic, like a city. It's good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're doing this unplanned encounters in this. All right, anyone else? Well, there were some other points you're going to be up here to make, I believe. I believe people are jumping in. Let's go over here. Oh, 20 more minutes here. Let's do this.
Back on the clock.
I think we have a question.
Yeah, no, come on.
Can I just say something to respond to some of these?
Please,
So,
we'll go into questions.
One of the things that became really clear to me doing the scenario exercise was that, it's way too early to be saying like what the right scheme for an entire country is, let alone an entire city. The first Model T rolled off, I don't know if it was River Rouge or a predecessor to it, in
predecessor.
1908. Here we are 107 years later, still debating what the role of the automobile in the city is. So we don't even have like a viable self-driving. Tesla just did the upgrade a month ago.
Yeah, look what
we can't possibly be thinking about like a final arrangement for that, or a final place for that technology. And I think it's part of the digital economy, the like values inherent in the technology, its capabilities, that it's flexible and allows many different configurations and solutions. So part of what I think we were trying to illustrate was that there will be different mobility regimes for different regions based on a whole bunch of different path-dependent preconditions, leadership decisions, corruption, whatever it is, right? And so, yeah, Houston might become the place where solar-powered self-driving sprawl is totally sustainable and actually better than, what we have in New York in terms of greenhouse gas impact. I don't know, but like there is a roadmap from here to there that's pretty plausible. It just requires people to get aligned behind a vision rather than just like stumbling into it by accident.
All right, we're going to do questions. One over here, I believe it's our friend from ITF,
What's ITF?
International Transportation Forum from OECD.
Okay, not the International Tennis Federation.
Yes,
We get a lot
that'd
of
be great
calls
too.
in June. Listen, I have a question because, Philip, you were just saying a city might choose to say, we want to favor public transport and we'll have no individually owned automated vehicles. But my question to the whole panel is it so inconceivable that TfL or the RATP in Paris would operate a fleet of fully automated vehicles as a fleet operator? Or is it so inconceivable that Ford or Daimler or a company that is yet to be incorporated in China would operate public transport services, bus services, as we see them? Because I think one of the things that's emerging is this, except, let me just make a big caveat to that, except the rules that prevent them from doing that at this stage in time. Is it something that we can see a much more fluid landscape between what we conceive as public transport and allow public operators to provide and what we see private operators providing in city spaces now that we have access to technologies and information services that allow this blending of lines?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you want to talk about illegibility, as it happens, the TfL doesn't operate bus services. The public transit companies of, for example, the Deutsche Bahn runs one of the bus lines, and the RATP runs one of the bus lines in London. So it's completely illegible to the actual rider who's operating the line. It is completely conceivable to me that somebody like TfL could step in and operate that. It's also completely conceivable that a public-private partnership could emerge, or an entirely privatized option would merchandise itself as essentially public transit. The lines are blurring, and the technology is only going to make that worse. What I'm always really interested to see is that private and public options be clearly distinguished so people can make resource allocation choices fairly. When we say things like we don't want higher taxes, but we depend vitally on public transit that's fed by those taxes. There's a disjunction there and a slippage that worries me. So I like for public transit to announce itself plainly and to be actually publicly funded and operated. But there's no reason at all why every single permutation that you mentioned and then some will emerge. I promise you that.
We agree on this one too, actually, quite strongly. It's not a, but actually, just on the funding point, because it's such an important point. I actually think that the whole. I want to just take your point earlier about bashing DOT to a higher level in terms of the feds. That I actually think the whole business of thinking that funding for transportation should be a federal responsibility is hugely deleterious. That in fact, most of our transportation that is within state, within metro area, it would be vastly healthier if we thought of them as local responsibilities that we had to raise local taxes to pay for, right? And particularly that we thought of as being paid for by user fees, like gas taxes, or even more absurdly in the case of airports, that we're using general tax revenues to pay for services where JFK riders are 10 times on average richer than the average American. Why in the world are they not paying for their own public services through user fees?
But you're actually already seeing that right now. I mean, you're seeing only 50% of most of the transportation funding is done at the federal level, and the rest is done at the city and the state level. And so that's happening. I think the piece that's also really interesting is I think there is a tremendous opportunity to harness the technologies that are out there right now to actually get some real revenue into our systems. I think that the GPS piece and the VMT piece, and marrying that and actually being able to have a win-win that goes along with that is really going to be key. And I think people are sort of agnostic about who provides the service. They just want the service provided. High quality, easy to get to, affordable, safe. That's, I think, a really important piece.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right on both points.
All right, more questions. There was one in the back, I believe. I know. Right here, gentleman in the front, please.
You know, it's not all, John Niles from Seattle, it's not all about the central city. I wonder if we could have a little commentary on layering. I mean, I've been dealing on this trip with Chelmsford and Woburn in the 93 and renting cars. I mean, there are a lot of, can we talk about some bigger distances? You know, people go skiing, my mother lives in the suburbs, et cetera. It isn't all about Manhattan and Cambridge, Boston. Just a little, the suburb commute is something you worry about, beltways. Can you talk, and there's all this talk about urbanization, but we all know that when you say urbanization, we're talking about the mega cities, you know, Boswash and Sansan and so on. So just a little commentary on these larger distance things and getting from city to city.
Anyway,
I mean, I would just say I think it's really interesting. The gentleman from Uber this morning made a very clear remark that, like, we don't, you know, we want people to come into cities because that's where we can run our business profitably. You know, I think tipping points are important. Like when you think about shared car fleets and things and self-driving, like when will we get enough private vehicles off the road and onto shared modes that we can start to take back parts of the street and do interesting things and, you know, sell the land and do all kinds of great stuff. And thresholds, right? So like what is the minimum viable density for a autonomous shared taxi fleet? What's the minimum viable density for an autonomous bus fleet, right? So we love buses, let's make them even better. Let's make them autonomous, right? Because labor is the biggest obstacle, labor cost to getting more frequency and coverage. So I don't think we know those answers. And the remark by a gentleman from Uber was stunning because it was the first time I ever thought, like, wow, like we might want to think about subsidies for Uber. To get them to go into, you know, poor suburban areas where, you know, we're seeing a lot of displaced people end up with no mobility options. So I learned something today.
Wow. Anyone else? No? Other questions? Gentleman over here on this side.
Hello, Anthony Eggert with the Climate Works Foundation. I'm curious, I think Professor Glaeser, you made mention of the fact that some of these areas that have the most, you know, walkable, transit-oriented, are also seeing the highest escalation of property values, rents, and things of that sort. So in thinking about it, well, actually, the question is that just really a function of lack of adequate supply? Because it seems inherently that those shouldn't be any more expensive to build. And I guess if the answer is yes to that, is there a time at which we do have adequate supply where that can then be a situation where we can provide affordable housing that's also walkable, transit-oriented, community-oriented, and you know, what do we need to do to get there?
You know, prices, I believe very strongly, always and everywhere, reflect the confluence of demand and supply. I don't think there's any repealing those laws. So I think it both reflects robust demand for these areas and limited supply of those units. In some cases, that the limits on supply are chosen by public policy, and it's right to do so. Right? So there are cases in which we think the historic character of the neighborhood is sufficiently important, sufficiently rich, sufficiently great for the city as a whole that we want to, limit the amount of new building. But that can't be true for all of Boston or all of New York either. And we have to think about ways in which we can balance both, the need to supply more homes and the need to preserve what is interesting, what is gritty, what is robust in the city. And I think it's important to start out by reminding us that there is no free lunch in this area. And this is actually one of the few areas in which I think the great Jane Jacobs got it wrong, where she, she very much advocates for the need for cheap space, and I think she's exactly right. But she then leaps from that to looking at old buildings and noticing that they were cheap, and new buildings and noticing that they were expensive, which leads her to conclude that the city needs to preserve old buildings and make sure no one builds any new buildings on top of old buildings. Well, that's not how supply and demand works at all, and you don't need to look any further than the Greenwich Village Preservation District, which she fought so hard to preserve in amber, right, to see what happens when you freeze a housing stock, right? I mean, this place that had ordinary income people living in it in the 1950s, that was affordable to ordinary people. Now, townhouses start at $8 million, and you need to either manage a hedge fund or work at NYU to actually live in this.
No, NYU.
Now, in fact, and I'm not saying that that's not great urban space and that it wasn't ultimately the wise decision, but it wasn't a free lunch, right? You were making a trade-off where you're trading character off against affordability. The technology challenge is to figure out when you do build how we can make that cheaper, how we can lower costs, how we can add density in a way that provides affordable homes for ordinary people. And that's partially an issue of the building technology. This is even more of an issue in, I'm I think more obsessed with developing world cities right now than I'm with developed world cities, but the need to provide low-cost modular homes in the developing world where you're talking about massive amounts of urban growth, right? You need to particularly plan for quick obsolescence because, in fact, anything that's appropriate for most sub-Saharan Africa cities today, right? Anything that's appropriate for Kinshasa today when per capita GDP in the Congo is $350 will hopefully not be remotely appropriate for the Congo in 20 years from now when with any luck GDP will be 10 times higher. So you need to plan for a city that does not get frozen in amber but that constantly updates itself. And that very much needs technological solutions around inexpensive but safe but humane housing. And that's something that, we're talking about transportation, but that is so much of something that I dream that the engineers are going to give us solutions for that are going to be, really vital for our growing world cities.
Great. Other questions? The lady in front here, please.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Rebecca Haywood. I'm a master's student here in transportation and city planning at MIT. I wanted to go back to something that Anthony had mentioned earlier, talking about the importance of stakeholder maps and in particular organized labor, which is such an important factor in transit in the United States. And when thinking about things like Uber is in many ways kind of the opposite issue. And that also ties into the conversation that was happening next door around equity and things like that. So my question is, how do you bring together these ideas and the working with stakeholders and in particular organized labor and things like that when bridging between transit, government, and these new models of transportation, kind of thinking that autonomy won't be here for quite a while now?
Anyone?
Yeah.
Anthony, Adam.
Honest answer, it's orthogonal to, I think, the way that you framed it, but it is the answer that I arrive at. Universal minimum income and buy them off. And, organized labor is something that I have a deep emotional affinity for and connection to, but I think they're ultimately in the long term playing a losing game. Just the not merely the technological stuff that's arrayed against them, but the lack of purchase on the mindset of the people that they claim to represent. And even hearing people on the stage referring to organized labor as sort of the last moment of friction that keeps something like bus service being more equitable to people, which frankly I've seen and I buy despite my strong affinities for labor. I think a fundamental reorganizing of society around the idea of a universal minimum income, guaranteed health care, and then the concerns that they have will tend to fall away, and that space will begin to open up, and you can bring some of the more technologically aggressive solutions to bear without robbing of them the resources that they have every right to expect the economy to provide them. That's the way that I see it.
You know, just one way of thinking about this from an employment point of view is the general transformation in the US, of course, has been from manufacturing to services, right? And even in the past 25 years, within high-tech jobs, at least according to the work of an economist named Deming, right, we've moved from the 1990s, which put a great value on pure cognitive load, to the past 10 years, which has put more weight on the combination of cognitive and social skills. Think about that in the structure of buses. So right now, we got guys driving buses. We don't need the guys driving buses anymore. But maybe we still need a human being on the bus. Maybe we need a human being to make sure that there's safety. Maybe we need a human being to think about the programming of the bus. Maybe we need a human being if the bus is carrying lots of young people to make sure they're doing something constructive and not killing each other, right? Maybe we need something that feels more like the social side of labor rather than the purely mechanical driving the bus that's around, because that's the thing that is much harder to automate away in some sort of way. So I think we want to be creative about ways that we can use people that aren't, that aren't going to be replaced by machines and actually still deliver value.
I would just throw one other thing, and this gets to kind of Adam's thesis in his talk, that systems like Uber essentially like turn drivers into a commodity, right? And that kind of depresses wages and does all these other things, reduces security, and that whole like 1099 gig working economy that's been kind of rightly criticized. There is, like I said, a counter-revolution to that emerging, and it's emerging from the kind of types that hang out at the Media Lab and hang out in San Francisco at EFF, the kind of, I call them like, internet Puritans, like people who believe that the internet should be decentralized. And that's both activists and investors, venture capitalists, that are looking at things like ethical crowd working platforms that don't just push work to the lowest costs, but actually allow workers to build up reputation and identity that can differentiate them and to port that across providers. And investors like Union Square Ventures in New York City, which is very actively looking at investing in all the tools that Uber drivers use to game the system. And other gig workers, and then looking at decentralized trust frameworks that would allow you to broker those transactions without using Uber as your clearinghouse, using things like blockchain. So there is, a counter movement to those things that's very much driven by values, as well as potential for financial gain. So I think it's an important countercurrent to look at.
Again, just very small intervention around maybe using the experience of a much more analog disruption in transport, which may have a few interesting lessons for even a much more complex, technologically complex context. When many Latin American cities were trying to formalize their transport system, moving essentially towards the bus rapid transit, they had to deal with often, highly corrupt and criminal organizations that were dealing with the informal bus service and the taxi service before. And the mayors that successfully implemented these systems in the end always had to ensure that there was some degree of sort of stakeholder arrangement to manage these transitions. And the successful cases really meant that literally the guy who was driving an informal vehicle was skilled and is able to drive a Transmilenio bus in Bogota. And similarly important that the smaller sort of companies that actually ran maybe 10 buses, they became a proper stakeholder in a much bigger organization. So there are, I think, also lessons to be learned from, let's call them sort of more analog transitions in this very politicized, very complicated and heated space.
All right, I believe we have time for one more question. Please, here in the front.
Hi, thanks so much. Since this is the last question, I'll zoom out to a broader picture. We're talking about disrupting mobility. Part of it's about the new things that have come in the last few years, but there's also so much mobility from the existing systems, right, that's been with us for over 100 years. So I was wondering, what's your thought on picking up from Professor Glaeser's point about improving buses, that could probably do much more than talking about the autonomous stuff for a while. What can we do about bridging the new disruption with disrupting the existing systems, for example, transit, to make it better? How can we bridge them together? Just to give an example, 2 weeks ago, there was a transit leader roundtable at MIT, which gathered literally the world's transit agency leaders. And if you look at this conference today, you see that there's absolutely no overlap between people who are invited to share ideas and to collaborate. So I'm interested to hear your perspectives from like a scholarly and also advisor role.
What did they say?
They said we approach things with cautiously and casually. I take that as
I don't even know what that means. Wow.
Can the farmer and the cowman be friends?
I think they can. I think they can. It's really interesting to see some of the cities that are actually playing with this and actually implementing it. Somebody showed a picture of Helsinki. You showed the picture of Helsinki, and they're doing some really interesting piece, in this sort of interim space, looking at, we've talked about mobility as a service. So what they're doing is they're completely redesigning their city to provide many more options for how people get around and integrating the payment platforms of those different systems. So the bus system, the taxi, the transportation network companies, all of the different players, ferries, everybody comes together and it's one platform. So you pay and you actually have a certain number of miles, that you can travel, in these different ways. And so it really is this mobility in your hand. So you can get around on all these different systems. It leverages all these different systems and ties it together in a completely new way. And I think that's going to be what we need to do. The trick of it is that it's very difficult. And I love, like I'm very close to the people in the transit industry and transit labor, ATU, TWU. You can't work in transportation in New York City without understanding deeply what that's about. But I think that we need to look at different ways of inviting them to the table, because it's very difficult to work with them. And we've got transportation. It's not so much the labor side of it as it is the technology in transit. We still, have, the Metro card, that's like ridiculous. We're not going to have real-time, information on our subway lines until 2022. And that was a big victory, on a capital program that almost went down the tubes. And so I think that we need to actually do what we can to incentivize with funding and with actual collaboration, the coming together for that shared platform to look at our cities literally as one big network. And I think that there's a huge opportunity between now and the advent of the AV network and the rest to make much more efficient use of the existing assets and bring many more stakeholders to the table and funders to the table to make that a reality.
Adam, the last word.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is that part of what's going on in Helsinki as well is literally tunneling beneath the city to create public spaces where there were none before. Helsinki is obviously a Nordic climate. They've got really tough constraints on them. So one of the things that they're investing in as part of this single platform is literally making more space in the city. Janette did similar things in New York City with making better, high-quality, mixed-use, high-density public spaces that really work for more people. You can make space out of nothing, and it requires enormous investments of capital, labor, energy, but it can be done. Mm-hmm. To the point about a single integrated platform, though, I thought I was going to get through a session without using my favorite go-to McLuhanism. I always say this, every extension is also an amputation. And what I think we need to bear in mind if we pull all of our assets into one single platform is that it doesn't become a single point of failure, and that those public spaces are designed robustly to the failure of our systems such that when they do go down, as they will, people can still find their way around in the old-fashioned way. That's the sort of design, the depth of design and the craft of design that I'd like to see happen in our spaces. But I think it will happen. I think conversations like this help it happen. And I think that the level of craft is just starting to get more sophisticated about this around the world.
Well, several times today, I've heard that the elevator was a fundamentally disruptive technology in cities, and now it is time to put the elevators at the Media Lab to the test as we go downstairs for the poster exhibition. So I recommend you also take the stairs and use the walkable city at its finest as well. So another round of applause for our panelists now that we are done with the session.